I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I have joining me from the National Investor, a longtime contributor, Chris Temple. Welcome back, Chris.
Hey, Mike.
Well, it's nice of you to take a break from your summer world tour of all your family. But once a year, all the Fed poobahs get together in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I don't know, they sit around a campfire, have s'mores, and talk economics. But that's just wrapped up this week. So let's take a look at the Fed and what they're maybe signaling for the markets going forward.
Well, the biggest thing everybody wanted to hear, which was already much of a fait accompli, frankly, Mike, everybody knew this was coming, and Powell just kind of, put the exclamation point on it, and that is that the Fed will start to reduce interest rates on a short end come September 18th when they conclude their next FOMC meeting. The jury's out on whether it'll be 25 or 50 basis points. The markets, after they threw this hissy fit there a few weeks ago, everybody was betting on 50 basis points, but it'll more than likely be 25 unless we have just a terrible debacle in the jobs report for August, which will come out after Labor Day. Likewise, if inflation continues to come down, or doesn't continue to come down, I'm sorry, then I think we could get 50, but the odds are 25. But Powell did hold out the possibility that they could, do more later if the data called for it. So, this really follows what he said after the last FOMC meeting and some other people looked at. And frankly, you've got probably 2 full percentage points of reductions to the federal funds rate that we're going to see in the next 12 to 15 months is my guess. But that does not mean the long end is going to come down. It does not mean inflation will be dead and buried. Part of the theme for this year is for the central bankers to cover their rear ends if they cut rates and inflation doesn't continue to come down. That's an interesting part of the messaging. But anyway, so Powell did confirm that we're going to start seeing rate cuts come next month.
Yeah, you were saying about a debacle in the jobs numbers coming up for August. Although, didn't we have like a preview debacle in the jobs numbers this week? All of a sudden, there was a massive reworking of the past year's numbers, and maybe we didn't create as many jobs as we thought we did.
Well, there's no maybe about it. We didn't. The Bureau of Labor Statistics came out and cut over 800,000 jobs from the grand total. I believe it was in a 12 months through April. Or some such thing. It's not up immediately to date, but they went back and looked at the figures more closely because keep in mind, each month, the reason you have revisions anyway, up or down, and it's not always been down in the past, but the reason you have revisions is because a lot of what the monthly jobs number is guesswork. They do a household survey more leaning towards small business and self-employed. They have a birth death model that has come under some controversy, if not ridicule, for not measuring things properly. But this latest announcement of over 800,000 jobs being vanishing that had previously been reported as created, that brought down the average monthly job creation number to something like 170,000. I'm just using the rough numbers from, they knock like 60-some thousand a month off the average of last year. Doesn't mean the economy's a disaster. Doesn't mean the jobs market's a disaster. A lot of political hay has been made over this in the last few days. One of the more comical things when Gina Raimondo, who is a former elected official, now is the Commerce Secretary for not lame duck, dead duck, Joe Biden. She was asked about this on the air, and she at first, and you would think somebody in her position knows these things, she first blamed Trump for this news that jobs were 800,000 less, didn't realize it was, a fellow agency within the federal government that came out with this. So she deservedly got a lot of ridicule over it. Republicans overall say that, Biden and Harris have been inflating the numbers. I don't think that's true because neither one of them really knows what the hell is going on from one day to the next. This is just a flawed model. And to me, what you've got to continue to look at is, all right, Granted, the jobs market is not as robust as a lot of the statistics had said. That was being talked about by you and I and others for months before the official revision came out. Let's look at the other evidence out there. Let's look at how much cardboard is being produced and shipped for the online economy. Let's look at what FedEx and UPS are saying. Let's look at what the retailers are saying. And that story has been the same now for quite a lot of months. And you and I have talked about this more than once, Mike, that the consumer increasingly has been, pulling their horns in, sitting on their hands a bit more, a little bit less discretionary spending, people buying plain label stuff rather than name brand stuff, et cetera. So this job revision number did not change the big picture one iota, that big picture being that, yes, we are inevitably and inexorably heading into an economic slowdown that may not be a disaster, but it's going to be tough given that we're going into this coming slowdown from the standpoint of having a third higher debt level than everybody had just, 4 years ago or something like that. That's going to be the big story going forward. And that's why the Fed is going to have to nuance its messaging as it starts cutting interest rates. And there will be multiple rate cuts starting next month. It won't be one, but we're not going back to zero either. And I've warned about that before. The Fed, I didn't hear Powell say it today, but in the past, they've talked about this mid-cycle course correction where they cut interest rates a few times or once or twice and they pause. And if they think they have to do more, okay, we'll cut it once or twice more. But we're still going to end up with a terminal interest rate that is much higher than what we got used to for a long time.
Yeah, although our interest rates right now still aren't anywhere near what the average interest rate was for the last, 40, 50 years. We just gone through a period of like really low interest. It'll be interesting after Labor Day because I am going to have the privilege of talking to John Williams of Shadow Stats about these job numbers and exactly what they're measuring and how they could be essentially so wrong for so long. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of a response we get out of John about that. I'm going to acknowledge that you're probably right, and that the Fed is likely going to, drop the interest rates by at least 0.25% in September here coming up. But at the same time, I look at the broader statistics and the Fed's mandate, and I can just as easily make a case for why the Fed wouldn't do nothing at all. Inflation is still above the 2% target. The other thing that they're supposed to look after is to keep the economy in full employment. And if you look at the unemployment numbers, they're less than 5%, 5% being the magic number the economists view as full employment in an economy. There's the fact that, we're only months away now from the U.S. election, and they may not wish to be seen as having influence on that. So you take those, they could do nothing, but I guess that would cause the market to, throw that hissy fit again, wouldn't it?
Oh, at this point, if the Fed, for some reason or the reasons that you cite in part, didn't reduce rates next month, most assuredly you would see a hissy fit in the market. But look, they're going to do it. First off, the political question is one that, I'll take Powell somewhat at face value. If you go back in past election cycles, the Fed has often hurt a party or an incumbent party as much as it's helped. Jimmy Carter didn't get any help from the Fed. George Bush Sr. famously blamed the Fed for costing him his reelection bid in 1992, et cetera. So, it's worked both ways over time. And, the Fed's going to do what the Fed's going to do to defend its own reputation, to the extent that it can, but also keeping in mind that the Fed is always late. The Fed has never engineered a soft landing to speak of in its life, just like the Fed was way too easy printing money and then way too slow to recognize the consequences of that and start to raise rates until it finally did. Most people believe that now on the other side, they're being too slow. You and I look at this, and I know John would, as an old school monetarist, and say, okay, the Fed's, got to limit how much money it prints. And that was one of the more humorous things of Powell's little speech this morning, is when he's blaming everything but himself for how inflation got out of control in the first place. It wasn't Vladimir Putin. It wasn't gouging grocery stores, price gouging grocery stores, or as Kamala Harris would say, price gauging grocery stores. It wasn't all of these bogeymen that added a third of the U.S. dollars ever printed in over 200 years inside of just a couple or 3 years. It was him that did it. So that's where inflation got its start, is from the Fed going apeshit, printing money more than anybody in recorded history of this galaxy or any others. Okay. And so that's why we got it. He doesn't want to address that. But at this point, he gets away with gaslighting the markets and the American people, just like most politicians in Chicago this week were getting away with gaslighting the public. So, he gets by. But he does know that because of a lot of factors, including how much money is still sloshing around out there, that it is going to be very difficult to get inflation down to 2%. But despite that, the stresses in the markets and the level of debt is such that they have to start cutting interest rates anyway and come up with any excuse after the fact to do it. So that's what he's going to do, and after raising rates 525 basis points, he obviously has some room to cut rates and have some left to spare. So we'll see. It's going to be a dance between him and the markets. It's going to be a dance to see if inflation does keep coming down, or, which is more likely in my view, and I've said this before, do they raise or do they cut interest rates a few times, but then inflation starts to turn around and reaccelerate? Then what happens? Because I think where we're going with this, and I'll say it again, inside of a year to a year and a half, you may well see the federal funds rate at 3% or 3.5% or something like that. But long-term yields will be the same or more likely higher than they are right now. And that's going to be when the markets demand a little bit more of an inflation premium as the Fed cuts rates. And arguably, as the Fed does cut rates, it will, all else being equal, increase the odds that inflation doesn't come down that much more.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I keep looking at all of the flashing red lights that scream recession, recession, recession. And I'm also wondering if not only are they screaming recession, but they're screaming stagflation is upon us, and we're just not seeing the numbers in the data yet.
Well, unquestionably. And look, some of the data that was out just this last week showed the average level of rents. They hit a new high last month, so they're not going down. All right. Housing costs overall are still elevated. Insurance costs are still elevated. Food costs are still elevated, if in some instances maybe less bad than they were. So you and I have talked a few times about a lot of the structural changes that are just going to make it difficult, if not impossible, for inflation to come down more and may make it turn around. But Powell is trying to cover his rear end, as are the other central bankers, in advance of being called on the carpet maybe next year sometime for cutting rates, with inflation still sticky, if not reaccelerating. You look at the theme itself for this year's summer picnic in Jackson. The theme was stated as, quote, reassessing the effectiveness and transmission of monetary policy, end quote. That was the theme of this year's conference, which I thought, frankly, they were going to harp on more last year. Maybe they didn't think they needed to. Now they think they need to. And bottom line, and for those that pull up Powell's speech afterwards to watch it, it was 16 minutes or some such thing. he wants to, again, blame everybody but himself for inflation. It's supply chains, it's government policy, it's COVID, it's the proxy war with Russia, it's whatever.
Don't forget Mercury retrograde.
Mercury retrograde, fans of the Blues Brothers movie like me, and when I post or repost the link to this thing, I'll include this cartoon. I had my cartoonist do a cartoon of Powell as if he was Joliet J. Powell. If you remember from the Blues Brothers, when Carrie Fisher confronted John Belushi underneath the culvert for standing her up at the altar, he goes on, "It wasn't my fault, honey. I swear to God, my tux didn't come back from the cleaners. I had a flat tire. It was locusts. It was everything." Well, that's the way Powell has been on inflation all of this time. It's everybody but him. And the central bankers now know that they need to cover their own rear ends. And so that's why you had this theme this year, is that, well, the effectiveness and transmission of monetary policy only goes so far. And if now they're going to be a little bit more overt in blaming policymakers and shortages and whatnot, then they can get away with satisfying the markets as much as they can by lowering interest rates somewhat, even if inflation stays elevated. When they get questioned about why are you doing that when inflation stays elevated, "It's not my fault, I swear to God." That's what you're going to hear.
My father used to say, whenever I was about to attempt something that I really shouldn't have attempted, he'd go, "If you don't know what you're doing, don't monkey with it." And I feel like that's where we've actually gotten, where the economy has been so monkeyed with that it's been broken, and it's time to call in the professionals to undo the damage of the do-it-yourselfers.
Well, and instead of calling in the professionals, the same people who got us into this mess continue to preside over it. And so, again, however, what you need to keep in mind is that we're going into an economic downturn of some fashion, which we're feeling it here in the U.S., not as bad as Europe, certainly not as bad as China, which is a big question mark looming out there still that may drag everybody further into deflation for all we know right now. But bottom line is that the markets, which across the board, it doesn't matter what you own today, everything is going up, whether it's the metals, whether it's bonds, whether it's junk bonds, whether it's stocks, small cap, large cap, mid cap, whatever, everything is levitating, as as the initial reaction would suggest, because the Fed is going to start cutting rates. But historically, by the time the Fed does belatedly cut rates during times like this, that usually ushers in the larger declines for equities as the Fed plays catch up on this end now and is going to try and catch up to a recession. So the challenge for investors going forward is going to be, and you and I, of course, will be covering this as time goes on, and it's going to, of course, it's going to be influenced greatly by the outcome of our November election here in the U.S. But the challenge is going to be which of these knee-jerk rallies that we're seeing across the board today are going to be durable and hold up as the great stagflation environment becomes ever more evident, and which are going to be flashes in the pan. Personally, I think that we're going to start to see a winnowing out that started in fits and starts recently, where a lot of the big cap stocks, the stuff that isn't supported by legitimate demand economically, that isn't supported by economic fundamentals, that isn't supported by good earnings and revenues and whatnot, we're going to start to see that winnowed away. It's going to be a process. It's not going to happen all at once. But that's what I'm looking at as we go into next year. And again, as it's going to be impacted, especially where commodities are concerned, by the winner of this November's election.
Yeah, I think one of the key words is going to be looking forward to is pivot. I know everyone's been looking for the Fed pivot to reduce interest rates, but I think what's going to happen is you're going to see a pivot from way the markets have been to reflect the way the economy actually is. Because if you look at the overall markets and the overall economic data, it's not broad. Like if you look at the jobs numbers, it's government and healthcare. That's where the jobs are being created. It's not across the broad, economy. The Dow being up, it's 7 stocks. It's not the whole Dow. Same with with the S&P. It's a handful of stocks. It's not the whole. It's not the whole index. It's not broad across the entire economy that things are going well, and I think you're going to start to see an investment and opportunities start to pivot from where they are today to where they need to be going forward.
Oh, you're exactly right. And so in a way, it's going to be a better and more honest and a healthier environment for investors and for the economy. But it's going to be a slog, and you're going to have to keep in mind, among other things, that with governments led by the Treasury having such a voracious demand for debt, it's going to squeeze a lot of the private sector out. You've got businesses, you've got restructurings that are happening, you've got refinancings that are happening. Even though everybody is having this sugar high today with Powell confirming rate cuts are about to start, people aren't, at least today, acknowledging the fact that, as I said, typically and historically has meant that the economic downturn is going to start gathering speed, and you're going to have to be a lot choosier about what you do. Just simply the Fed lowering short-term rates is not going to be your salvation.
No, and be careful what you wish for, because if they're lowering the interest rates now, they see something coming.
Well, right, and that's probably, Mike, why they're not going to go 50 basis points next month unless something that we can't foresee right now happens. They don't want to tell everybody that they're panicked and panic everybody else by having a cut by that much, right out of the gate. Not that might not happen later, but I don't think they'll start with that.
No, I don't either. But as I say, I can easily make a case for them to not to do anything. So, although I think you're right that they will cut a quarter. So,
yep.
Between now and then, I'm sure you and I will have something else to talk about. I think there's actual jobs numbers coming out after Labor Day. I think there's another CPI and PPI before the next Fed meeting. So yep. We'll continue to monitor things. And now that the Democratic National Convention or Cretin group is done with their meeting in Chicago, we could probably start to have discussions as to what's likely to happen if former President Trump becomes president, or Vice President Kamala Harris becomes president, because I think that would lead itself to two completely different economies as well.
Well, they would be to a great extent. Now, of course, we've had just minutes before you and I started recording this, the added dynamic of Robert Kennedy endorsing Trump and suspending his campaign. And there's a whole lot of different reasons why he's done that, which is a whole different discussion. But the extent to which that solidifies Trump's odds, we'll figure out in the coming days.
It's definitely a very tight horse race, and I'm certainly not wanting to handicap it. So
me neither, even with this today.
It's been a pleasure having you on, and I look forward to having you on again soon.
Yeah, me too. Take care, Mike.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.